Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we travel farther back than almost any story we have ever explored before. Farther than the pyramids, farther than ancient Greece, farther even than the first kingdoms most people remember from history books. Tonight, we return to the moment when humanity first stopped wandering and began building civilization itself. Tonight, we walk into the forgotten world of the Sumerians, the mysterious black-headed people who raised the first cities beside the rivers of Mesopotamia, who pressed the first words into wet clay, who divided time into hours and minutes, who created schools, laws, taxes, contracts, kings, debt, and perhaps even the very idea of history itself. But the deeper I went into the story of Sumer, the more unsettled I became. Because this is not simply the story of an ancient civilization, it is the story of us. Their cities were crowded and noisy. Their people worked exhausting days under burning heat. They worried about food, feared floods, prayed to unseen powers, borrowed money they could not always repay, and wondered whether the world they were building would survive after they were gone. Sometimes I imagine standing at the gates of Uruk at sunset, hearing bronze hammers echo through dusty streets, smelling barley bread and smoke drifting from crowded homes, while somewhere above the city, a lonely scribe presses tiny wedge-shaped symbols into clay, unknowingly changing the future of humanity forever. And what fascinates me most is how fragile it all was. Because the first civilization on Earth, the civilization that taught humanity how to build cities and rule kingdoms, eventually collapsed beneath war, famine, ecological disaster, and the slow exhaustion of the very land that once gave it life. There is something haunting about that thought, that the people who invented civilization may also have been the first to discover how easily civilization can disappear. So tonight, as the rivers of the ancient world begin to rise beneath the moonlight, we will travel together through temples, markets, ziggurats, flood myths, royal courts, forgotten schools, and silent ruins buried beneath desert sands for thousands of years. We will meet kings who dreamed of immortality, priests who studied the stars, mothers who sang lullabies beside oil lamps, workers trapped by debt, and scribes who preserved humanity's memory one clay tablet at a time. And perhaps somewhere inside their story, we may discover something unexpected about ourselves, about the strange human desire to build things that outlive us, even when we know they may someday vanish into dust. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace. Sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, slowly settle into the darkness, and let us return together to the land between two rivers, where civilization first opened its eyes beneath the ancient stars. Sometimes I try to imagine what this land looked like before civilization had a name, before kings carved their victories into stone, before laws, temples, and cities rose from the dust of Mesopotamia. There was only water, mud, mud, endless reeds swaying beneath the wind, and two immense rivers moving slowly through the silence of the ancient world. The Tigris, wild and unpredictable, and the Euphrates, broader, calmer, carrying life through lands that otherwise would have been swallowed by emptiness. Even now, thousands of years later, there is something almost dreamlike about this place, because it was here, between these rivers, that humanity first began learning how to live together, not merely survive, but organize, build, remember, and dream beyond a single lifetime. And what fascinates me most is this: why here? Why did the first civilization emerge in a land so dangerous, so unstable, so unforgiving? Because Mesopotamia was never gentle. The rivers that fed the earth could also destroy it without warning. A flood arriving too early could drown entire settlements. A flood arriving too late could leave the fields cracked beneath a merciless sun. The people who lived here existed in constant uncertainty, every harvest balanced between abundance and catastrophe. Sometimes I imagine standing beside those rivers at dawn, hearing only the sound of water pushing against reeds, the distant cries of birds rising from the marshes, and somewhere nearby, small groups of humans watching the currents with anxious eyes, wondering whether the rivers would spare them this year or sweep everything away. The strange thing is, instead of fleeing this dangerous land, they stayed. And slowly, something extraordinary began to happen. They learned that the floods left behind rich black soil, fertile enough to grow barley in astonishing quantities. What first appeared to be chaos became opportunity, but only if people worked together. A single person could not control the rivers. One family alone could not dig canals across the plains. It required dozens, sometimes hundreds, laboring beneath brutal heat with mud-covered hands, carving pathways through the earth so water could reach the fields. And perhaps that is where civilization truly began, not with kings, nor temples, nor armies, but with cooperation born from fear. Because the rivers forced human beings to depend on one another in ways they never had before. The more I think about it, the more Sumer feels less like an invention and more like an answer to a problem, a desperate attempt by fragile humans to create order in a world that seemed ruled by unpredictable forces. And to the people of this ancient land, those forces were alive. The storms, the floods, the droughts, they were not accidents of nature. They were the moods of gods. Above them all stood the great sky god, distant and unreachable. But the god most feared was Enlil, lord of storms and raging winds, the one who could unleash destruction across the rivers without warning. In later myths, people spoke of him almost with trembling, as though all civilization existed only by his temporary mercy. Yet against this fear stood another figure, Enki, god of wisdom, fresh water, and hidden knowledge. Unlike Enlil, Enki was remembered as humanity's protector, the god who taught people how to survive in this uncertain world. Sometimes I wonder if Enki represented something deeper. Perhaps he was the ancient Sumerians' way of expressing a truth they already understood, that intelligence, cooperation, and knowledge were the only defenses humanity possessed against chaos. In the old stories, Enki lived beneath the earth in the Abzu, a vast underground ocean of fresh water hidden below the world. To the Sumerians, life itself emerged from these unseen waters, and maybe that is why their civilization always carried this strange feeling of existing between two realities, one human and one divine. Every canal dug into the earth, every mud brick shaped beneath the sun, every prayer whispered beside a riverbank felt connected to powers far greater than themselves. And yet, despite all their fear, despite floods, disease, hunger, and uncertainty, they kept building. That may be the part of the Sumerians that feels most familiar to me, because even now, thousands of years later, humanity still lives this same contradiction. We build cities beside dangerous coastlines. We create nations beneath fragile skies. We fear collapse, yet continue building anyway. Perhaps civilization has always been an act of hope performed in defiance of uncertainty. And as night slowly settled over ancient Mesopotamia, as oil lamps flickered inside humble mud brick homes, and distant thunder rolled across the flat horizon, the first people of Sumer must have looked toward the dark rivers and wondered the same thing we still wonder today, whether the world they were building would endure or someday vanish back into the silence from which it came. The more I read about the Sumerians, the more mysterious they become, because even now, after centuries of archaeology and thousands of recovered clay tablets, no one truly knows where they came from. They appeared in southern Mesopotamia more than 6,000 years ago, and somehow, within a relatively short span of history, they transformed scattered villages into the first civilization on Earth. But who were they before that? Where did they live before the first cities rose from the mud beside the Euphrates? And perhaps most haunting of all, what memories did they carry with them into this new world? When the Sumerians referred to themselves in their own writings, they often used a phrase that scholars still remember today: the black-headed people. It sounds strangely intimate. It sounds almost as if they were trying to distinguish themselves from the unfamiliar peoples surrounding them. I sometimes imagine ancient scribes pressing those words into wet clay beneath flickering oil lamps, unaware that thousands of years later, strangers from another age would still be wondering who they really were. What makes the mystery even deeper is their language. Sumerian does not comfortably belong to any known language family. It stands alone, isolated like a surviving fragment from a forgotten world. To linguists, it is almost like hearing an echo from a civilization with no surviving relatives. And there's something strangely emotional about that, because language is memory. It carries the fingerprints of migrations, fears, beliefs, and ancient journeys. Yet Sumerian seems to arrive in history almost fully formed, as though it emerged from the mist without warning. Some scholars believe the Sumerians evolved gradually from older peoples already living in Mesopotamia, especially the Ubaid culture, quiet farming communities who had already begun settling the marshlands long before the first great cities existed. Perhaps civilization was not born suddenly at all, but slowly through generations of people adapting to rivers, learning irrigation, shaping mud bricks beneath the sun. If that is true, then Sumer was less an invention and more a long awakening. But another possibility continues to haunt historians even today: the idea that the first Sumerians came from somewhere else entirely, arriving by sea through the Persian Gulf, bringing with them strange knowledge, unfamiliar customs, and memories of a homeland now lost beneath the waves. I cannot help thinking about how terrifying the ancient sea must have seemed. Dark waters stretching endlessly beyond the horizon, fragile boats drifting toward an uncertain shore, carrying families, tools, seeds, and stories. Perhaps the oldest memory of this arrival survived through myth, because centuries later, Babylonian writers described a mysterious being named Oannes, a creature half man, half fish, who emerged from the sea at dawn to teach humanity the arts of civilization. He taught people how to write, how to build temples, how to organize cities, how to measure the heavens. To modern ears, Oannes sounds like fantasy. Yet ancient myths often hide fragments of memory inside symbolism. And sometimes I wonder whether Oannes was never meant to be a monster at all, but a distant recollection of travelers arriving from the sea, strangers carrying knowledge that transformed the world forever. Then there is the most haunting theory of all: the flood. Long before the biblical story of Noah, the peoples of Mesopotamia told stories of a catastrophic deluge that nearly destroyed humanity. Uh, Sent. In the oldest Sumerian versions, the gods decide to wipe out mankind with overwhelming waters, and only one man survives by building a great vessel to preserve life. The details vary across centuries, but the emotional core remains the same: terror, loss, survival, and memory. And what unsettles me most is this: the story may not have been entirely mythical. At the end of the last ice age in Shamros, rising seas flooded enormous areas around the Persian Gulf. Lands that were once fertile plains slowly disappeared beneath salt water. Villages may have been swallowed over generations, forcing entire populations northward toward Mesopotamia. If this happened, then perhaps civilization itself was shaped by refugees, people fleeing environmental collapse, carrying trauma across drowned landscapes, trying to rebuild their lives beside dangerous rivers. There is something deeply human about that idea, because it transforms the Sumerians from distant legendary figures into survivors, people who lost homes, ancestors, and familiar worlds, people trying to preserve memory before it vanished forever. Maybe that is why flood myths appear again and again in Sumerian literature, not merely as religious stories, um, but as collective scars passed from one generation to the next. The more I think about it, uh, the more civilization begins to feel less like triumph and more like resilience. The first cities may not have been built by conquerors or kings, but by exhausted people searching for stability after catastrophe, by families who had already watched one world disappear beneath rising waters. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians worked so desperately to create permanence, temples of mud brick, written records, laws, walls, names pressed into clay, because somewhere deep inside them, they already understood how fragile human existence could be. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if the reason their story still feels strangely alive to us is because we recognize something familiar in it. The fear of losing the world we know, and the stubborn hope that even after disaster, humanity can begin again. I sometimes think the first true contract in human history was not written between people, but between humanity and the river itself. Because long before kings ruled cities, before laws were carved into stone, before merchants counted silver beneath temple roofs, there were only small communities staring out across the dangerous waters of Mesopotamia, trying to understand whether nature could be controlled or only survived. The rivers gave life, but they demanded obedience in return. And perhaps that was the beginning of civilization. Not wealth, not conquest, but negotiation. A fragile bargain between human beings and the unpredictable world around them. In the earliest days, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates must have felt both beautiful and terrifying. During certain seasons, the plains exploded with fertility. Dark, wet soil stretching toward the horizon beneath endless skies, birds filled the marshes, fish crowded the waterways, and barley grew from the earth with astonishing abundance. But then the rivers would rise, suddenly, violently, swallowing homes, drowning fields, tearing away entire settlements in muddy torrents. The same waters that fed life could erase it overnight. And the people of early Sumer understood something that changed history forever. If they wanted stability, they could no longer live as isolated families. One person alone could not resist the rivers. One household could not redirect floodwaters or store enough grain to survive disaster. The scale of the challenge was simply too great, so slowly, almost invisibly at first, humans began organizing themselves in ways no society had ever attempted before. I imagine long lines of workers beneath the scorching Mesopotamian sun, their feet sinking into wet earth, their hands raw from digging through mud with primitive tools. Men, women, perhaps even children carrying baskets of dirt while sweat mixed with river water beneath relentless heat. There was nothing glorious about this labor. No heroic battle, no magnificent palace, only exhaustion, repetition, and survival. Yet these muddy trenches carved into the land would eventually change the course of humanity because they were canals, artificial veins carrying life across the plains, directing water toward distant fields before the rivers could reclaim it. And what fascinates me is this: canals required planning. Someone had to decide where they should go, someone had to organize labor, distribute tasks, settle disputes, and ensure people continued working even when exhaustion set in. In other words, the rivers forced humans to invent cooperation on a massive scale. Civilization may have begun the moment people realized survival depended on strangers, trusting one another. The more I think about it, the more ancient Mesopotamia feels like a giant experiment in collective existence, a place where humanity first learned how difficult it truly is to live together. The Sumerians shaped mud mixed with straw into bricks and left them drying beneath the sun. Those simple bricks became houses, walls, storehouses, and eventually temples reaching toward the heavens. There is something strangely poetic about the fact that the first civilization on Earth was built from mud. not marble, not gold, but earth taken directly from the rivers themselves, almost as if Mesopotamia was slowly reshaping its own body into cities. Day after day, people worked not only against nature, but alongside it, trying to guide forces far greater than themselves. And because the world around them felt unpredictable, the Sumerians saw divine powers everywhere. Storms were not weather, but the anger of Enlil. Floods were not accidents, but signs of cosmic judgment. Meanwhile, Enki, wise god of fresh water and hidden knowledge, became humanity's protector, the divine figure who understood rivers instead of merely fearing them. I sometimes wonder whether these gods reflected different human responses to uncertainty. Enlil representing terror, Enki representing intelligence, adaptation, and problem solving. Perhaps myths were not separate from civilization, but part of the psychological machinery that allowed it to function. Because if thousands of exhausted workers believed canal labor was sacred, if they believed digging irrigation systems fulfilled the will of the gods, then labor itself gained meaning beyond survival. In later Mesopotamian stories, humanity is literally created to perform labor for the gods, to carry baskets, dig canals, and maintain order in the world. At first glance, this sounds harsh, almost cruel, but perhaps beneath the myth lies a deeper truth. Civilization always demands shared effort. Every city in history, every empire, every modern society rests upon invisible networks of cooperation and labor. And in Sumer, humanity was discovering this for the first time. Sometimes I imagine the silence after a day of digging finally ended, workers returning slowly toward clusters of mud brick homes beneath a darkening sky, the smell of wet earth still clinging to their skin, distant frogs calling from marshes while smoke drifted upward into the evening air. Perhaps they looked across newly finished canals with quiet pride, knowing that the rivers would now feed their families for another season. Or perhaps they simply collapsed from exhaustion, unaware they were participating in one of the most important transformations in human history. Because what emerged from this exhausting relationship with nature was something entirely new: organized society, leadership, division of labor, shared infrastructure, collective memory, the earliest foundations of civilization itself. And maybe that is the strange lesson hidden beneath the mud of ancient Sumer, that civilization does not begin when humans become powerful, but when they become dependent on one another. There is a moment in human history that fascinates me more than almost any battle, any empire, or any king. The moment when people stopped living only for the next season and began building something meant to outlast themselves. Because for thousands upon thousands of years, humanity had lived in small, scattered groups, villages surrounded by uncertainty, where survival depended almost entirely on weather, hunting, and luck. But in southern Mesopotamia, something slowly began to change. The canals worked. The rivers, once feared as destroyers, now carried life deep into the plains. Harvests became larger, more reliable, and for the first time in history, humans produced more food than they immediately needed. I often think about how revolutionary that single change truly was. Because a surplus of grain did more than feed hungry people, it created free time, and free time changed everything. Suddenly, not everyone needed to farm. Some people could shape pottery, others could work metal, some became builders, merchants, priests, administrators, and eventually scribes. Entire layers of society appeared where before there had only been survival. Civilization did not emerge all at once. It grew slowly from stored barley, from granaries filled beneath temple walls, from the realization that food could become power. The more grain a settlement controlled, the more workers it could support. The more canals it could build, the larger it became. And in this new world, one institution slowly rose above all others: the temple. At first glance, early Sumerian temples were simple structures of mud brick, larger than ordinary homes. but still humble compared to the monuments that would come later. Yet emotionally, spiritually, economically, they became the center of everything. The temple was not merely a place of worship, it was a storehouse, a workplace, a treasury, a government, and in many ways, the beating heart of early civilization. Families brought portions of their harvest there as offerings to the gods. Grain was collected, measured, redistributed. Workers received rations. Labor was organized, and canals were maintained through temple authority. I sometimes wonder if the first economy in human history was born not from greed, but from fear. Fear that without organization, the rivers would once again reduce humanity to scattered, fragile villages, because beneath all the growing order of Sumer, there remained an awareness that nature could still destroy everything. And perhaps that is why religion became inseparable from government. The people believed the gods themselves owned the land. Human beings were merely caretakers living temporarily beneath divine authority. This idea shaped everything. The fields belonged to the city's god, the harvest belonged to the temple, and the leaders who managed society were not originally kings in the later sense, but priest rulers, mediators standing between heaven and earth, trying to preserve what the Sumerians called divine order. I find that phrase strangely beautiful, divine order, because it reveals how early humans understood civilization itself. Not as something artificial, but as a sacred balance holding back chaos. In their minds, canals did not simply irrigate fields, they preserved cosmic stability. Temples did not simply store grain, they maintained harmony between humanity and the gods. Every brick, every offering, every ritual was part of keeping the world from falling apart, and nowhere embodied this feeling more deeply than Eridu. The city many Sumerians later remembered as the first true center of civilization. Even today, Eridu feels almost mythical, rising from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia like the memory of a dream. According to ancient tradition, kingship itself first descended from heaven there. The Sumerians believed Eridu stood at the point where the human world touched something divine. It was sacred to Enki, god of wisdom, water, and hidden knowledge beneath the earth. I imagine Eridu not as a massive city, but as something quieter, almost mystical. Reeds swaying beside canals, fishermen moving through misty marshes at dawn, smoke rising slowly from mud brick homes, while priests climbed temple steps beneath enormous open skies. Somewhere inside those early settlements, humanity crossed an invisible threshold. Villages were no longer temporary places surviving one season at a time. They were becoming permanent worlds with memory, hierarchy, tradition, and identity. And perhaps that is the moment civilization truly began, when people no longer saw themselves merely as families, but as citizens of something larger than themselves, a shared human structure built to endure beyond individual lives. Yet with permanence came another transformation, ambition. Because once one settlement grew wealthy from grain and trade, others wanted the same. Competition emerged, influence expanded, and populations increased faster than anyone could have imagined. Slowly, the scattered settlements of southern Mesopotamia began evolving into something entirely new. True cities, crowded, noisy, powerful, and alive with possibility. And among them, one city was beginning to rise above all others, a place whose walls, temples, and restless energy would eventually change the destiny of humanity forever. Uruk, the first great city of the ancient world, was waking beneath the sun. Sometimes I try to picture the moment when a human being first stood outside the walls of Uruk and realized this was no longer just a settlement, no longer merely a cluster of homes beside a river, but something entirely new in the history of the world. A city. Perhaps they approached slowly across the dusty plains of Mesopotamia beneath the burning afternoon sun, hearing sounds long before they saw the walls themselves. The distant cries of merchants, the groaning of wooden carts, bronze hammers striking metal, donkeys braying beneath heavy loads of grain. Thousands upon thousands of human voices blending together into something almost alive. Because Uruk was unlike anything humanity had ever created before. Around 5,500 years ago, this city began rising beside the Euphrates like a vision from another age. At its height, nearly 50,000 people may have lived there, a number so enormous for the ancient world that it almost feels impossible to imagine. For most of human history before this, people had lived in small groups where nearly everyone knew one another. But Uruk changed that forever. For the first time, strangers lived side by side in crowded streets, dependent upon systems, rules, labor, and organization too vast for any single person to fully understand. In many ways, Uruk was the first world made entirely by humans, and I think that must have felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The city itself rose from the earth in layers of mud brick and dust, tightly packed flat-roofed homes stretching endlessly beneath the sky, narrow alleys twisted between buildings like veins through a living body. The air must have been thick with heat, smoke, animal smells, sweat, and the constant noise of movement. Donkeys pushed through crowded streets carrying sacks of barley, bundles of reeds, jars of beer, and imported materials from distant lands. Merchants shouted prices in busy marketplaces while potters spun clay beside open workshops. Somewhere nearby, bakers prepared flatbread over open fires, and metalworkers hammered glowing bronze beneath drifting sparks. The deeper I imagine Uruk, the more modern it begins to feel. Because for the first time, human beings were no longer living mainly inside nature. They were living inside systems created by other humans, surrounded not by forests or open wilderness, but by walls, streets, laws, trade, labor, and social hierarchy. Civilization had become an environment of its own, and surrounding all of this, towering above ordinary homes and workshops, stood the walls of Uruk. Ancient stories later claimed they were built by the legendary king Gilgamesh himself. Their immense size separated the city from the dangerous unknown beyond. For the first time, humanity enclosed itself inside monumental boundaries and declared, "This place belongs to us." I sometimes wonder how profound that psychological shift truly was, because walls do more than protect. They divide the civilized world from everything outside it. Inside the walls was order, identity, and belonging. Outside was uncertainty, wilderness, and threat. Yet the true heart of Uruk was not its walls, but its temples, rising above the crowded city like mountains of mud brick and sacred stone. The most beloved among them belonged to Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, beauty, desire, and war, a deity as complex and unpredictable as the civilization itself. The people of Uruk believed she watched over the city, shaping its destiny beneath the heavens. Priests and priestesses served within her sacred precincts, while offerings of grain, beer, incense, and precious goods filled the temple storehouses. Sometimes I imagine the emotional atmosphere surrounding these sacred places, the sound of prayers echoing through courtyards at sunrise, smoke curling upward into pale morning skies, workers carrying offerings beneath painted banners, while distant drums vibrated softly through the streets. Religion in Uruk was not separate from daily life. It was woven into everything: trade, politics, agriculture, even survival itself. And above all, the temples, shining beneath the Mesopotamian sun, stood the White Temple, dedicated to Anu, god of the sky, built atop a massive platform. Um, its pale walls could be seen from far across the plains, almost as if the city itself were reaching upward toward heaven. The higher humanity built, the closer they hoped to come to the divine. And perhaps that is what moves me most about Uruk, because beneath all its noise, ambition, and growing complexity, there remains something deeply human, a longing to create permanence in a fragile world. The people of Uruk were experimenting with a completely new way of living, one no species had ever attempted before. Thousands of unrelated individuals surviving together through cooperation, labor, belief, and organization. They did not know it yet, but they were inventing urban life itself with all its beauty, opportunity, inequality, loneliness, creativity, and tension. And somewhere inside those crowded streets, um, beneath the shadow of temples and the endless movement of people, humanity was beginning to transform forever. Because once humans learned how to build cities like Uruk, there would be no turning back. Civilization had awakened, and the world would never again belong only to rivers, forests, and wandering tribes beneath the stars. There is one moment in human history that feels almost impossible to fully comprehend, a moment so quiet, so ordinary on the surface, that nobody living through it could have understood what had just happened. Somewhere inside the crowded world of Uruk, beneath the heat and dust of ancient Mesopotamia, a human hand pressed symbols into wet clay, and memory itself changed forever. I often think about how strange it is that writing one of the greatest revolutions in the history of civilization was not born from poetry, philosophy, or grand ideas, but from accounting, from grain, livestock, taxes, and the exhausting complexity of managing thousands of human lives inside the first city on Earth, because Uruk had become too large for memory alone, and the temples collected barley from countless farmers, workers received food rations, merchants exchanged goods across growing trade routes, and administrators needed some way to keep track of it all. Human speech was no longer enough. Words vanished as soon as they were spoken. Promises could be forgotten, agreements disputed, numbers confused. Civilization itself was becoming too complicated to exist only inside the human mind. And so, out of necessity, writing was born. At first, the system was astonishingly simple. Small clay tokens shaped into symbols representing goods like sheep, jars of oil, or measures of grain. These tokens were sealed inside hollow clay balls to record agreements between people, almost like the world's earliest contracts. I imagine merchants sitting cross-legged beside temple courtyards, carefully counting tokens while scribes watched nearby beneath drifting sunlight. Yet even this system eventually became inefficient because to know what was inside the clay ball, one had to break it open. So gradually, people began pressing the tokens directly onto flat clay tablets instead, creating visible impressions that could be read without destroying the record itself. It seems like such a small change, but sometimes history turns on tiny practical decisions. Over generations, those impressions evolved. The drawings became simplified, abstract, transformed into wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with cut reed styluses. And from those tiny wedges emerged cuneiform, the first true writing system in human history. The more I think about it, the more emotional this moment becomes, because this was not merely the invention of symbols. It was the moment humanity discovered how to preserve thought beyond a single lifetime. Spoken words die, written words remain. For hundreds of thousands of years, human memory disappeared with the dead. Stories survived only if someone remembered them. Knowledge vanished when elders were lost to age, but clay tablets changed that forever. Suddenly, information could outlive the people who created it. A voice pressed into wet clay could survive centuries, even millennia, waiting silently beneath dust for another human being to discover it again. There is something deeply haunting about that. Sometimes I imagine a Sumerian scribe sitting alone at dusk inside a temple archive, carefully pressing symbols into damp clay while oil lamps flicker against mud brick walls, perhaps exhausted, perhaps bored, unaware that thousands of years later, strangers from another age would still hear echoes of his thoughts. And among those ancient records, one name quietly survives above all others, Kushim. And if the first known human name ever written down in history, not a king, not a conqueror, not a legendary hero, but an accountant, someone tracking a barley transaction inside the immense machinery of Uruk. I love that detail so much because it feels profoundly human. The first identifiable person preserved by writing was not immortalized for glory, but for administration. Civilization remembers him simply because he was doing his job, and somehow that makes the ancient world feel startlingly close to our own. Um, as writing spread through Uruk, it quickly became sacred. The Sumerians believed such extraordinary knowledge could only come from divine inspiration, so that they gave writing its own goddess, Nisaba, lady of wisdom, grain, accounting, and scribes. In in hymns from scribes praised her as the keeper of heavenly records, the guardian of knowledge itself. I imagine young apprentices whispering prayers to Nisaba before practicing signs on clay tablets, hoping the goddess might guide their trembling hands. Because writing was difficult, painfully difficult, mastering hundreds of symbols through endless repetition. Yet those who learned it gained extraordinary power, and they could calculate harvests, organize labor, preserve laws, record myths, and communicate across generations. In many ways, writing became the nervous system of civilization itself. Without records, Uruk could not have managed its immense population, its temples, trade, taxation, or irrigation systems. Accounting created bureaucracy. Bureaucracy created organization and organization allowed civilization to expand beyond anything humanity had ever attempted before. The strange truth is that civilization may have been built not only by kings and laborers, but by quiet scribes pressing marks into clay in dimly lit rooms, preserving the fragile memory of human society one tablet at a time. And perhaps that is why I find early writing so moving, because beneath all its practical functions, it represents something deeply emotional: the human refusal to disappear, the desire to leave a trace, to preserve a thought, a name, a story, against the endless silence of time. Long after Uruk itself would crumble into dust, long after its temples collapsed and its people vanished, those clay tablets remained buried beneath the earth, waiting patiently for humanity to remember itself again. The more I study the world of Uruk, the more I realize something extraordinary. Civilization did not rise because ancient people suddenly became wiser than those before them. It rose because necessity cornered humanity into becoming inventive. Every crowded street, every overloaded granary, every flooded canal, every growing population created problems no human society had ever faced before. And in trying to solve those problems, the people of Sumer accidentally reshaped the future of the entire species. Sometimes we imagine ancient inventions appearing in dramatic flashes of genius, but I suspect most began quietly, in workshops filled with dust, sweat, frustration, and repetition. Somewhere in Uruk, perhaps inside a cramped pottery workshop near the marketplace, someone placed clay on a spinning platform and realized the work became easier, smoother, faster. The wheel may have begun not as transportation, but as pottery, a simple rotating surface allowing artisans to shape vessels with astonishing efficiency. I like imagining that moment, hands covered in wet clay, the slow turning motion beneath the fingertips, and the sudden understanding that rotation itself could transform labor. Because once humanity understood the wheel, everything changed. Eventually, someone attached that rotating disc to an axle beneath a wooden frame, and the first carts were born. It sounds almost simple to us now, but in reality, it was revolutionary beyond measure. Suddenly, grain could be moved farther, heavier goods transported more easily, trade routes expanded, and entire economies accelerated. The wheel reduced physical effort in ways humanity had never experienced before. And what fascinates me most is this: many of the technologies we now consider ordinary were not invented for luxury, but survival. Uruk's growing population demanded efficiency. Feeding tens of thousands of people required more than hard labor. Uh, It required intelligent labor, and so another invention emerged from the fields of Mesopotamia, the plow. Before the plow, farming depended largely on hand tools, slow, exhausting work beneath relentless heat. But by harnessing animals to wooden blades cutting through the earth, a single farmer could cultivate vastly larger fields. More grain meant larger surpluses. Larger surpluses meant more specialization. And specialization pushed civilization even further forward. I sometimes think of the plow as one of the quietest inventions in history. It does not feel dramatic like armies or kings, yet without it, cities like Uruk may never have survived. Entire civilizations rested upon the simple act of turning soil more efficiently, and the Sumerians understood how sacred these tools truly were. In hymns, they praised agricultural instruments almost like divine beings, because to them, technology was not separate from spirituality. The hoe, the plow, the canal, these were gifts allowing humanity to survive against chaos. Meanwhile, inside the workshops of Uruk, another transformation was unfolding. For most of human history, people had relied upon stone, wood, and bone. But Mesopotamian artisans learned how to master fire itself. At first, copper was hammered into simple shapes, soft and fragile, yet eventually they discovered how to melt metal in furnaces and pour it into molds. And when copper was mixed with tin, something stronger emerged, bronze. I often imagine the emotional impact of that discovery, glowing liquid metal illuminating dark workshops. Sparks rising into smoky air, craftsmen staring in awe as molten bronze cooled into weapons, tools, and blades unlike anything humanity had possessed before. Bronze changed warfare, agriculture, labor, and status. Those who controlled metal controlled power, and yet, perhaps the most profound invention of Sumer was invisible: mathematics. Because once cities became large enough, people needed systems capable of measuring reality itself. Grain, land, time, labor, trade, all required calculation. The Sumerians created units of measurement for almost everything, systems allowing humans to standardize the world around them. And from this effort emerged one of the strangest legacies of ancient Mesopotamia, the sexagesimal system, based on the number 60. I find it incredible that we still live partly inside a mathematical structure invented over 5,000 years ago. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle. All of it traces back to the minds of Sumerian scholars and administrators trying to solve practical problems inside crowded cities beside the Euphrates. The more I think about it, the more astonishing it becomes. Every time we look at a clock, we are unknowingly carrying fragments of Sumerian thought into the modern world. Perhaps that is the strange nature of civilization. The dead continue shaping the living in ways we rarely notice. I imagine scribes carefully calculating grain distributions, while priests studied celestial patterns atop temple platforms, watching the moon, the sun, and the stars move across the heavens. In trying to organize earthly life, they also began measuring cosmic rhythms. Time itself became something humans could divide, predict, and control. And maybe that was the deeper revolution happening in Uruk. Humanity was no longer merely adapting to nature. It was learning how to systematize reality, how to impose structure onto chaos through tools, mathematics, writing, and machines. Yet beneath all this innovation, there remains something deeply human: exhaustion, pressure, necessity. The people of Sumer did not invent because they were living in comfort. They invented because civilization demanded constant solutions. And perhaps that is the hidden engine behind much of human progress. Necessity creates genius, not comfort, not abundance, but difficulty. The crowded streets of Uruk forced humanity to think differently, to organize differently, to imagine differently. And in solving the immediate problems of survival, the Sumerians unknowingly built foundations that still support the modern world thousands of years later. Sometimes I wonder what those ancient workers would think if they could see us now, living inside civilizations powered by descendants of their ideas. Wheels still turning, clocks still measuring, cities still expanding, humanity still trying to master the same chaos that first confronted us beside the rivers of Mesopotamia. Sometimes when people imagine the ancient world, they picture only kings, temples, wars, and monuments rising beneath forgotten skies. But the more I learn about the Sumerians, the more I realize that civilization was not truly built by rulers alone. It was built inside ordinary homes by exhausted parents, hungry children, old stories whispered beside oil lamps, and small acts of love repeated day after day beneath the shadow of Uruk's walls. And so tonight, I want to leave behind the great temples and crowded marketplaces for a little while and step quietly into the home of an ordinary Sumerian family, because I think this is where the ancient world begins to feel startlingly familiar. The streets outside are already darkening beneath the evening sky. Narrow alleys twist between mud brick homes while distant voices still echo faintly through the city. Somewhere farther away, donkeys groan beneath heavy loads returning from the markets, and smoke drifts slowly upward from ovens baking the final flatbreads of the day. Inside one modest house lives a potter named Ur-Nammu. Not a king, not a priest. Simply a man trying to provide for his family inside the first great city humanity ever built. From the outside, the house appears almost fortress-like, thick mud brick walls, very few windows, protection against heat, dust, and thieves. But once inside, the atmosphere changes completely. The center of the home opens into a quiet courtyard beneath the fading light of evening. And there, beside a grinding stone worn smooth by years of use, Ur-Nammu's wife kneels patiently crushing barley into flour. The sound is rhythmic, stone against stone, slow, repetitive, almost hypnotic. I sometimes imagine how many millions of women across history performed this same motion, preparing food not only for survival, but for family, continuity, and home itself. Nearby, a small child watches her work with sleepy eyes, while another chases shadows across the courtyard walls, laughing softly beneath the warm evening air. And suddenly, the distance of 5,000 years begins to disappear because this family is not alien to us at all. They worry about food, about illness, about children growing safely into adulthood. They are tired after long days. They want peace inside their home. They want tomorrow to be kinder than today. Before the evening meal, Ur-Nammu pauses beside the doorway and lifts a quiet prayer toward the heavens. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, simply personal, almost intimate, asking the gods for protection, fairness, and another day of survival beneath uncertain skies. I find moments like this deeply moving because they remind me that ancient religion was not merely mythology. Um, for people in Uruk, the gods were woven into everyday existence. Every flood, every sickness, every successful harvest felt connected to unseen forces watching over the fragile world of humans. Soon, the family gathers for dinner, perhaps lentil stew, onions, flatbread, and weak barley beer shared from clay cups. The meal is simple, but there is comfort in routine, comfort in sitting together after another difficult day inside the restless machinery of the city. And as darkness settles more fully over Uruk, another tradition begins, the stories. An elderly grandfather leans closer to the flickering oil lamp while children gather nearby in silence. Outside, the sounds of the city slowly fade, replaced by distant dogs barking somewhere beyond the alleyways. The old man begins recounting stories of heroes and kings long before written history could preserve them. Perhaps he speaks of Gilgamesh, mighty king of Uruk, or of floods sent by angry gods, or of strange spirits wandering beyond the city walls at night. I sometimes think storytelling may have been humanity's first defense against fear, turning chaos into narrative, making suffering feel meaningful, giving children courage before sleep. But night in ancient Mesopotamia was never entirely comforting, because once darkness fell, another world awakened, the invisible world. The Sumerians believed demons moved silently through the night, searching for weakness. And among the most feared of all was Lamashtu, a terrifying spirit said to prey upon infants and mothers slipping into homes after sunset, bringing illness, nightmares, and death. To modern minds, these beliefs may sound strange, but I cannot help seeing something deeply human beneath them. Ancient parents feared losing children just as parents do today. In a world without medicine, where disease arrived suddenly and explanation was scarce, invisible spirits gave shape to helplessness. Near the sleeping child, hanging quietly from the wall, is an amulet bearing the face of Pazuzu, another demon, but one believed to protect families against Lamashtu's attacks. I find that detail strangely beautiful. Even demons in Mesopotamian belief were complicated. Fear fighting fear, chaos restraining greater chaos. Perhaps every civilization invents symbols of protection when confronted with uncertainty too painful to control. Eventually, the oil lamp burns lower, conversations fade, and one by one the family drifts towards sleep beneath the warm night air. Some climb to the rooftop where cooler winds move gently beneath the stars above Mesopotamia, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls of Uruk, the rivers continue flowing silently through the ancient world, carrying with them the dreams, fears, and fragile hopes of the first people who ever tried to live together inside a city. The more time I spend imagining families like this, the harder it becomes to see the Sumerians as distant strangers from a vanished civilization. Because beneath all the temples, inventions, and myths, they were simply human beings, loving, fearing, struggling, and hoping exactly as we still do now. The deeper I travel into the world of ancient Sumer, the more I realize that its people never truly felt alone. Even inside the crowded streets of Uruk, even within the safety of mud brick homes and towering temple walls, the Sumerians believed invisible beings moved constantly around them, watching, whispering, waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of firelight. To them, um, the world was alive with forces no human eye could fully see: gods, spirits, ghosts, demons, and and restless powers drifting silently between the living and the dead. And perhaps nowhere does the emotional heart of ancient Mesopotamia feel more intimate or more unsettling than in the fears people carried with them after sunset. Because night in Sumer was different from night in the modern world. There were no lamps illuminating entire streets, no medicine, no certainty, no understanding of disease or mental illness. Once darkness spread across the city, the familiar world dissolved into shadows, and the invisible world awakened. I sometimes imagine lying awake inside a small Sumerian home long after midnight, hearing distant dogs bark somewhere beyond the alleyways, the faint movement of wind against reeds outside the walls, perhaps a baby crying softly in another room, and beneath it all, a terrible uncertainty, because if sickness entered your house, if fever took hold, if nightmares returned again and again, how could you know whether the cause was natural or supernatural? For the Sumerians, these questions were terrifyingly real. Illness was rarely seen as random. Misfortune often meant some invisible force had crossed the boundary into human life. A spirit, a curse, a demon, or the restless ghost of someone improperly buried. They believed the dead themselves could become dangerous, especially if funeral rites were neglected. Such spirits were known as Giddim, wandering ghosts trapped between worlds, eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, searching for warmth among the living. I find this belief strangely moving, because beneath its supernatural imagery lies something deeply human: the fear of being forgotten after death, the fear that loneliness itself could continue forever. Perhaps these ghost stories reflected ancient anxieties about memory, family, and belonging, because in Sumerian society, proper burial rituals ensured the dead remained connected to the living. Without remembrance, the soul became lost, drifting through darkness without peace. But among all the creatures feared in Mesopotamia, none inspired greater dread than Lamashtu. Even now, thousands of years later, her name still carries something deeply disturbing. The Sumerians imagined her as a monstrous female demon who preyed upon mothers and infants, slipping silently into homes at night, bringing sickness, nightmares, and death to newborn children. I sometimes think about how vulnerable families must have felt in the ancient world. Infant mortality was devastatingly common. Diseases arrived without warning, and no parent could fully protect a child from forces they did not understand. Lamashtu gave shape to those fears, turning invisible tragedy into something the mind could confront. She became the embodiment of helplessness as itself. Yet what fascinates me most is how the Sumerians responded to fear, because they did not simply surrender to it. They fought back with rituals, symbols, prayers, and magic. Hanging inside many homes were protective amulets bearing the face of another terrifying being, Pazuzu. Unlike Lamashtu, Pazuzu was not entirely evil. He was a demon associated with storms and desert winds, grotesque in appearance, with wings, claws, and a snarling expression. Yet, because he hated Lamashtu, families invoked him as a protector. I love the strange complexity of that idea. In ancient Mesopotamia, even protection came from dangerous forces, chaos restraining greater chaos. Fear turned against fear. It feels strangely ancient and strangely modern at the same time, because even now humans often create symbols of security from the very things that frighten them. When illness became severe, families turned not to doctors, as we would today, but to specialists known as exorcists, the Ashipu. These figures occupied a mysterious place within Sumerian society, part priest, part healer, part magician, carrying ancient knowledge preserved on clay tablets filled with incantations and ritual instructions. I imagine one arriving quietly at night inside a worried household, carrying oils, herbs, figurines, and sacred texts beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp. The air inside the room heavy with fear while exhausted parents watch silently from the shadows. Then the chanting begins. Ancient words repeated rhythmically into the darkness, commanding invisible forces to depart. Some surviving texts still preserve these incantations, voices echoing across more than 4,000 years. You wandering spirit, leave this house, flee through the window like smoke, depart into the desert where no living thing remains. There is something haunting about reading those words today, because they reveal how desperately ancient people wanted control over suffering. Magic in Sumer was not entertainment. It was survival, a psychological defense against a world filled with uncertainty. And perhaps that is why these ancient fears still feel strangely familiar. Because despite all our modern knowledge, humans have never fully escaped the darkness beyond understanding. We still fear unseen illness, sudden tragedy, nightmares, grief, loneliness, and death. The names have changed, but the emotions remain remarkably similar. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the people of Uruk lying awake beneath the stars of Mesopotamia, listening to distant winds moving across the rooftops, wondering whether unseen beings watched from the darkness beyond the walls. And in those moments separated from us by 5,000 years, the Sumerians no longer feel distant at all. They feel human, frightened, vulnerable, and desperately searching for protection in a world they could never completely understand. Sometimes I think the first true scientists in human history were not working inside laboratories, but standing silently atop ziggurats beneath the cold night skies of Mesopotamia, watching the stars move above the sleeping city of Uruk. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, they lifted their eyes toward the heavens, searching for something humanity has always longed for: certainty. Because the ancient world was filled with unpredictability, rivers flooded without warning, crops failed, diseases spread suddenly through crowded streets, kings rose and fell beneath the violence of war. And in the middle of all this uncertainty, the sky appeared different, orderly, rhythmic, eternal. The moon returned. The stars followed patterns. Planets wandered in ways that seemed mysterious yet strangely precise. And somewhere deep inside themselves, the people of Sumer began to believe the heavens were speaking. The more I imagine those nights, the more atmospheric they become. Far above the narrow streets and sleeping homes of Uruk, priest astronomers climb the steep stairways of towering ziggurats, carrying clay tablets, measuring chords, perhaps small oil lamps trembling in the desert wind. Beneath them stretches the first city on earth, dark rooftops disappearing into shadow while distant dogs bark somewhere beyond the walls, and above them, endless stars burn across the Mesopotamian sky with terrifying clarity. In a world untouched by artificial light, the heavens must have felt overwhelming, alive, almost divine in their immensity. To the Sumerians, the sky was not empty space. It was a sacred text written by the gods. Every eclipse, every wandering planet, every unusual movement in the heavens carried meaning. The stars were not simply beautiful. They were messages, warnings, omens of things yet to come. And perhaps that belief reveals something timeless about human nature, because even now, despite all our technology, we still search for signs about the future. We still fear uncertainty. We still want to believe the chaos of life follows patterns we can understand. The Sumerian astronomers observed the heavens with extraordinary patience, recording the movements of celestial bodies on clay tablets over centuries. They tracked the moon, the changing positions of stars, and especially Venus. The brilliant wandering light associated with Inanna, goddess of love, beauty, war, and power. I sometimes imagine them watching Venus rise before dawn over the horizon of Mesopotamia, bright and lonely above the rivers, perhaps feeling as though the goddess herself were moving across the sky. Certain celestial events filled the ancient world with dread, especially eclipses. Imagine the terror of suddenly watching the moon darken unexpectedly, or the sun itself disappear in the middle of the day. To us, eclipses are predictable astronomical events, but to the Sumerians, they felt like cosmic disturbances, warnings from the gods that something terrible might soon unfold. A lunar eclipse could foretell war, famine, plague, or the death of a king. And so the priest astronomers watched constantly, recording every unusual occurrence alongside events happening on Earth. If a flood followed an eclipse, it was written down. If disease spread after the appearance of a strange star, that too became part of the record. Over generations, these observations accumulated into vast systems of omens, attempts to uncover hidden relationships between heaven and earth. The Sumerians believed nothing happened randomly. Everything carried meaning, every shadow crossing the moon, every halo around the stars, every movement above the city. And strangely enough, in their search for divine messages, they began uncovering genuine patterns hidden inside the universe. The mathematics of the heavens slowly emerged from superstition. Right. They noticed celestial cycles repeating with astonishing regularity. They discovered that certain eclipses returned according to predictable intervals. They divided the path of the sun through the sky into sections that would eventually evolve into the zodiac. And once again, necessity drove genius. Because to track the heavens, the Sumerians required increasingly sophisticated mathematics, numbers capable of measuring cycles, angles, and time itself. Their sexagesimal system based on 60 proved remarkably useful for astronomy, allowing complex divisions and calculations unlike anything earlier societies possessed. Sometimes it amazes me that modern humanity still lives partially inside the mathematical imagination of ancient Mesopotamia. Every clock, every circle divided into 360 degrees, every hour measured into 60 minutes carries echoes of Sumerian skies. The dead continue shaping our lives in ways we rarely notice. Yet beneath all the calculations, all the astronomy, all the observations scratched carefully into clay, there remains something deeply emotional driving this ancient pursuit: fear of the unknown future. Because the future has always frightened humanity. The Sumerians were no different. They wanted reassurance that floods could be anticipated, that wars might be avoided, that kings could survive, that disaster would not arrive without warning. The stars offered the illusion that chaos itself might obey hidden laws. Perhaps that is why the night sky became sacred across so many civilizations, because when humans look upward, we instinctively search for meaning, for order, for some sign that existence is not entirely random. I sometimes imagine one of those ancient astronomers standing alone atop a ziggurat long after midnight, cold wind moving across the high temple platform while the city sleeps below, carefully marking the movement of Venus onto damp clay, unaware that thousands of years later, human beings would still gaze upward, asking the very same questions. What will happen tomorrow? What do the heavens mean? And are our lives part of some greater pattern we cannot yet fully understand? The more I explore the world of ancient Sumer, the more I become convinced that one of humanity's greatest inventions was not the wheel, nor bronze, nor even writing itself, but teaching, because knowledge alone cannot build a civilization if it dies with the people who possess it. For civilization to survive, memory must pass from one generation into the next, carefully, intentionally, endlessly. And somewhere inside the crowded cities of Mesopotamia, humanity created something entirely new to make that possible. The first schools in history. I often imagine the beginning of a school day in Uruk, long before sunrise. The city still half asleep beneath the fading stars, while narrow alleys slowly fill with movement. Somewhere beyond the markets and temples, boys carrying damp clay tablets hurry through dusty streets toward a building known as the Ejuba, the House of Tablets. It sounds almost peaceful when translated that way, but life inside these schools was far from gentle. The Eduba existed because civilization itself had become too complicated to function without trained minds. Temples needed accountants, rulers required administrators, merchants depended on contracts, and cities demanded records for grain, labor, taxes, trade, and law. Writing had become the nervous system of Sumerian society, and scribes became the people responsible for keeping that system alive. In many ways, they were among the most powerful individuals in the ancient world, not because they commanded armies, but because they controlled information. I sometimes think about how rare literacy must have felt in those days. Most people in Uruk would never learn to read or write. The symbols pressed into clay remained mysterious marks understood only by a small educated elite. To become a scribe required years of exhausting discipline, endless memorization, and relentless repetition. Inside the Eduba, students sat cross-legged with clay tablets balanced carefully before them. The teacher, often a respected senior scribe, dictated signs while older students supervised the younger ones. Every wedge-shaped symbol had to be copied again and again and again until the hand itself seemed to remember the motion automatically. I imagine the atmosphere inside those schools: warm air, thick with dust and concentration, the soft scraping of reed styluses pressing into wet clay, nervous students trying desperately not to make mistakes, because mistakes were punished harshly. Surviving Sumerian texts written by students themselves describe the fear of discipline inside the Ediba. One complains bitterly, "My teacher said there were missing signs on my tablet, and he beat me." Another recalls being struck simply for speaking out of turn. There is something strangely familiar about these ancient complaints, because even across 5,000 years, students still fear failure, teachers still demand discipline, and education still carries pressure. Yet beneath the harshness, something extraordinary was happening. Humanity was learning how to preserve knowledge systematically. Before writing and schools, wisdom survived mainly through memory and oral storytelling. But oral traditions are fragile. Stories change. Details disappear, generations forget. The Ejuba transformed memory into something more durable. Literature, mathematics, legal formulas, myths, prayers, contracts, all could now survive beyond the lifespan of individual people. Civilization no longer depended entirely on living memory. It could be stored, copied, and taught. And perhaps that is why I find the scribes of Sumer so fascinating, because they became guardians against oblivion itself. Somewhere inside quiet schoolrooms of Mesopotamia, young students copied ancient myths onto clay tablets, preserving stories that otherwise would have vanished forever. Without those scribes, we might never have known Gilgamesh, flood myths to Inanna, or the voices of ordinary Sumerians speaking across thousands of years. The more I think about it, the more I think about it, the more emotional it becomes. Because civilization survives not only through power, but through transmission, through one person teaching another, through parents, storytellers, and scribes refusing to let memory die. The Edoba was not simply a school, it was a machine for cultural survival. Students learned far more than writing alone. They studied mathematics, administration, religious texts, astronomy, and literature. They memorized legal formulas for contracts and disputes, learned measurements for grain and land, and practiced the precise language required to run an increasingly complex urban society. In many ways, these schools became the first institutions of higher learning in human history. I sometimes imagine a young student sitting alone after lessons have ended, exhausted hands stained with clay, quietly tracing symbols beneath dim lamplight while the city outside settles into darkness. Perhaps he dreams of becoming an important scribe someday, respected inside temple bureaucracy, able to rise above ordinary labor. Because literacy in Sumer opened doors unavailable to most people. A skilled scribe could enter royal courts, manage temple economies, advise rulers, and preserve the voice of kings themselves. It was said among the Sumerians that the art of the scribe was the mother of teachers and the father of orators. Knowledge itself had become a form of power. And yet, what moves me most about these first schools is not their bureaucracy, nor their discipline, but their quiet determination to resist forgetting. Every civilization fears disappearance. Every culture fears silence. The people of Sumer understood this perhaps more deeply than anyone before them, so they created schools, trained scribes, copied stories, and pressed memory into clay so the future might still remember they once existed. Sometimes I think that is one of the most beautiful things have ever done. Teaching another person what you know, not because it benefits you immediately, but because you hope something of your world will survive after you are gone. The more civilization grows in the story of Sumer, the more another truth slowly emerges from beneath the temples and inventions. Civilization does not merely create cities, laws, and knowledge. It also creates hierarchy, layers of power separating human beings from one another. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the social world of ancient Mesopotamia. Because the same civilization that gave humanity writing and mathematics also divided people into ranks, privileges, duties, and inequalities that shaped every part of daily life. Sometimes I imagine standing in the center of Uruk at midday, watching the city move around me like a living machine. Priests climbing temple stairways beneath embroidered robes, merchants bargaining loudly beside crowded markets, laborers carrying baskets of mud beneath crushing heat, slaves disappearing silently through alleyways with lowered eyes. Everyone inside the city belongs to a place within the great social structure, and everyone knows it. For the Sumerians, hierarchy was not viewed as unfair. It was seen as natural, even sacred. They believed the social order reflected the order established by the gods themselves. At the top stood the Lugal, literally the great man, the warrior king, ruler of the city, commander of armies, and protector of divine order. The Lugal was more than a political leader. He stood at the center of earthly and heavenly authority combined. When people looked upon the king, they did not simply see a man. They saw someone chosen to maintain stability between humanity and the gods. I sometimes wonder how overwhelming that responsibility must have felt, because if crops failed, if floods destroyed canals, if enemies invaded, or if disease spread through the city, the king himself could be blamed for losing divine favor. Yet beneath the grandeur of kingship lay immense privilege. The elite classes of Sumer lived very differently from ordinary people. High priests, military commanders, wealthy scribes, and noble families controlled much of the land. They managed temple wealth, oversaw labor, and enjoyed protections unavailable to the majority of society. Their homes were larger, their meals richer, their clothing finer, while ordinary laborers struggled simply to survive another season. Most people in Sumer were peasants, farmers, fishermen, artisans, and workers whose lives revolved around exhausting labor. Day after day, they maintained canals, harvested barley, shaped bricks, repaired walls, and supported the machinery of civilization itself. Yet much of what they produced belonged not to them, but to temples, rulers, or elite landowners. I sometimes think there is something timeless about that reality, because throughout history, civilizations often depend upon invisible labor performed by people who rarely benefit fully from the systems they sustain. And at the very bottom of Sumerian society existed slavery, one of the darkest foundations beneath the brilliance of early civilization. Slaves could be prisoners of war, debtors unable to repay loans, or individuals born into bondage. In legal terms, many were treated not as persons, but as property. Bought, sold, inherited, marked with ownership. It is uncomfortable to confront this truth, but important because the first civilization carried within it many of the same moral contradictions humanity still struggles with today. Great achievements often rise beside great suffering. Yet the social world of Sumer was more complicated than simple oppression alone. Family life remained deeply important. Marriage formed the foundation of society, not merely as romance, but as economic alliance, inheritance, survival, and continuity. Fathers arranged marriages, bride prices were negotiated, dowries exchanged, and households built around patriarchal authority. I imagine wedding ceremonies illuminated by torchlight, families gathered beneath temple blessings while musicians played softly in crowded courtyards. But beneath the formal structure, there are still glimpses of genuine affection surviving inside Sumerian poetry. One ancient fragment mourns the illness of a beloved wife with heartbreaking tenderness. The light of my eyes has gone out, and suddenly, across 5,000 years, grief sounds exactly the same. Women in Sumer occupied complex and often contradictory roles. With twist, many lived under strict social expectations centered around marriage, childbirth, and domestic labor. Yet some women also wielded remarkable authority, especially within religious institutions. Among the most fascinating were the Naditu, elite priestesses dedicated to temple life. Unlike most women, they could own property, lend silver, manage estates, and conduct business independently. In a world dominated by male political power, these priestesses occupied unusual positions of economic influence. And then there is Queen Puabi, one of the most haunting figures from ancient Mesopotamia. Her royal tomb discovered at Ur contained extraordinary treasures, gold jewelry, musical instruments, luxurious artifacts, and the remains of attendants sacrificed to accompany her into death. What moves me most about Puabi is that her seals identify her not merely as the wife of a king, but as a queen in her own right. Perhaps she ruled independently. Perhaps her authority rivaled the most powerful men of her age. Yet even her magnificence reveals something unsettling about civilization, because her greatness rested upon hierarchy so absolute that human lives were buried beside her as offerings. Sometimes I think ancient Sumer feels emotionally complex because it mirrors so many contradictions still present within human society. Cooperation created civilization, but civilization created inequality. Cities produced beauty, knowledge, and innovation, yet also hierarchy, exploitation, and control. The same systems that allowed humanity to flourish collectively also divided people into ranks of power and vulnerability. And maybe that is one of the deepest truths hidden inside the story of Sumer. Civilization always asks a difficult question: how do millions of human beings live together without creating systems where some rise high above others? The Sumerians answered that question in one way. And ever since then, humanity has continued struggling with it. Sometimes late at night, I imagine the lights of Uruk flickering beneath the stars while kings feast behind palace walls. Priests whisper prayers inside temples, laborers sleep exhausted beside cooling ovens, and somewhere in the darkness, slaves dream quietly of freedom. All of them living together inside the first great hierarchy humanity ever built. Sometimes when we think about civilization, we imagine monuments, kings, temples, and armies. But the more I study ancient Sumer, the more I realize that civilization is built first upon something much simpler: food, energy, and exchange. Because no city can survive on ideas alone. Uruk did not rise from philosophy. It rose from barley fields, canals, fish pulled from muddy rivers, and countless workers eating enough to survive another day beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Civilization begins when human beings learn not only how to produce food, but how to organize its movement, its storage, and its distribution across thousands of lives. And nowhere is that reality clearer than in the daily economy of ancient Sumer. I often imagine dawn breaking over the fields outside Uruk, the sky turning pale gold above canals reflecting quiet water, farmers already working beneath the early heat, cutting barley with simple blades while distant birds move across the marshes. Barley was the foundation of everything, not merely a crop, but the fuel of civilization itself. It became bread, beer, wages, taxes, and eventually even a form of currency. The Sumerians depended on it so completely that entire systems of labor and power revolved around its harvest. I find it strangely moving that one of humanity's first great civilizations rested upon something so ordinary: grains carried in baskets beneath dusty skies. Yet without those fields, the temples would empty, the markets would collapse, and the city itself would starve. Bread in Sumer was simple: flat loaves baked from coarse barley flour ground slowly by hand. I imagine the sound of grinding stones turning inside homes throughout Uruk and Uruk, women kneeling patiently for hours preparing the flour needed to feed their families. It was exhausting labor, repetitive, unavoidable, but deeply connected to survival. And alongside bread, there was beer: thick, cloudy, nourishing. Perhaps more important than many modern people realize, in ancient Mesopotamia, beer was not merely recreation. It was daily sustenance, safer to drink than canal water, rich in calories, and distributed as part of worker rations. Laborers, builders, priests, and even scribes received beer alongside grain as payment for their work. Civilization itself literally ran on bread and beer. I sometimes picture groups of workers resting beneath patches of shade during the hottest hours of the day, sharing large clay jars through long reed straws, while dust drifts slowly through the heavy air. There is something surprisingly communal about that image. Civilization held together not only through laws and labor, but through shared routines of eating, drinking, and surviving together. Beyond the barley fields, the rivers provided another essential source of life. Fish from the Euphrates and Tigris formed a major part of the Sumerian diet, dried, salted, traded through busy markets beside canals and harbor districts. And then there were dates, sweet fruits hanging from palm groves like small pockets of stored sunlight, um, rich in sugar, easy to preserve, portable enough for travel and labor. The more I think about it, the more ancient Sumer feels like a civilization constantly transforming natural energy into organized human activity. Grain becoming labor, labor becoming cities, cities becoming power. Yet, as Uruk expanded, simple barter slowly became insufficient. In small villages, people could exchange goods directly, a pot for grain, fish for cloth. But in a massive urban society with thousands of strangers, uh, trade became far more complicated. What happens when the potter needs dates, but the farmer has no use for pottery? Civilization required a universal measure of value, something capable of moving through the economy more efficiently than food itself. And so, silver slowly emerged as one of the ancient world's first true forms of money. I find this transition fascinating because silver possessed almost mystical qualities in Mesopotamian society: rare, beautiful, durable, associated with the glow of the moon itself. Unlike grain, silver did not rot. It could travel long distances, accumulate wealth, and connect entire regions through trade. Soon merchants carried silver across Mesopotamia, exchanging textiles, metals, timber, stone, and luxury goods between distant cities. The rivers themselves became highways of commerce, boats drifting slowly between settlements loaded with resources civilization desperately needed because southern Mesopotamia lacked many natural materials. There was little stone, little timber, and few metals. So trade became essential to survival. I sometimes imagine arriving at the markets of Uruk during their busiest hours. As donkeys groaning beneath heavy cargo, merchants shouting over one another, bronze tools glinting beneath sunlight, fish drying beside canals, baskets overflowing with dates, scribes carefully recording transactions on clay tablets. It must have felt chaotic, alive, almost modern in its complexity. And beneath all this movement lay a deeper truth about civilization itself, that cities survive only through exchange, not merely of goods, but of labor, trust, information, and energy. The more people gather together, the more dependent they become on systems connecting strangers to one another. In many ways, civilization is simply organized dependence made permanent. And perhaps that is why economies feel both powerful and fragile, because once a society depends upon large networks of exchange, any disruption can become catastrophic. A failed harvest, interrupted trade, or shortage of silver could ripple outward through the entire system, affecting thousands of lives. Um, Sometimes I think the Sumerians already understood this intuitively. They knew prosperity was never guaranteed. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every shipment of silver moving through Uruk represented countless hidden relationships holding the city together. Civilization was no longer just about survival against nature. It had become an enormous web of human interdependence. And maybe that is one of the strangest truths hidden inside the story of Sumer, that even the greatest cities in history ultimately depend upon very fragile things: rivers flowing correctly, fields remaining fertile, and strangers continuing to trust one another long enough to keep the system alive. The more I explore the economy of ancient Sumer, the more unsettling it becomes because beneath the temples, the markets, and the grand achievements of civilization, another system was quietly taking shape, one that still feels painfully familiar today: debt. At first, the idea probably seemed harmless, even necessary. A farmer suffers a failed harvest after floods destroy the fields. A laborer cannot feed his family through the dry season. A merchant needs silver to finance a journey along the Euphrates. Civilization had become too complex for survival to depend only on immediate resources. People now needed ways to borrow against the future. And so the earliest financial systems in human history slowly emerged from the temples of Mesopotamia. I sometimes think there is something almost ironic about this, because the same temples built to maintain divine order also became centers of economic power. Inside their storerooms were vast reserves of barley, silver, livestock, and goods collected through taxes and offerings. Priests and administrators carefully recorded these resources on clay tablets, measuring debts, repayments, and obligations with astonishing precision. So, in many ways, the temples of Sumer became the world's first banks. Farmers could borrow grain before planting season, merchants borrowed silver for trade expeditions, families struggling through difficult years took loans simply to survive. At first glance, this sounds practical, even compassionate. Uh, Credit allowed society to function despite uncertainty. But once loans exist, another idea soon follows: interest. And perhaps this was one of the most important turning points in the emotional history of civilization, because now time itself became profitable. A person could lend resources today and demand more in return tomorrow. The future had become something that could be owned, measured, and exploited. I imagine a weary farmer sitting before a temple scribe agreeing to repay a barley loan after harvest season, perhaps hopeful that the rivers will flood gently this year, hopeful his children will have enough to eat. But what happens if drought arrives? What if disease spreads through the fields? What if the harvest fails? Debt does not disappear simply because life becomes difficult. And slowly, across Mesopotamia, many ordinary people found themselves trapped inside obligations they could no longer escape. Clay tablets surviving from Sumer record contracts, interest rates, repayments, disputes, and desperate promises carved into wet clay thousands of years ago. Reading them today feels strangely intimate, because beneath the formal language, you can almost feel human anxiety pressing through the words: fear of losing land, um, fear of hunger, fear of failing one's family. The more civilization expanded, the more inequality deepened. Wealth accumulated in the hands of temples, elites, merchants, and powerful landowners, while many laborers and farmers struggled beneath increasing burdens. Some people eventually lost not only their harvests, but their freedom, because in ancient Mesopotamia, debt could become slavery. I find that reality deeply haunting. A person unable to repay loans might surrender land, livestock, children, or even themselves into servitude. Families could be torn apart because of unpaid obligations. Human beings reduced to economic assets within systems originally created to stabilize society. It is uncomfortable to admit, but one of humanity's first great civilizations quickly discovered that economic systems can consume the very people they were meant to support. And alongside debt came taxation, another permanent feature of civilization. Kings and temples demanded portions of harvests, labor, livestock, or silver to maintain canals, armies, temples, and administration. In theory, taxes sustained the city. In practice, they often fell heaviest upon ordinary workers already struggling to survive. Sometimes I wonder what ancient peasants truly thought about the systems governing their lives. Did they view taxes as sacred duty, or did they whisper quiet frustrations inside mud brick homes at night after another exhausting season beneath the sun? Because surviving texts occasionally reveal glimpses of social tension, complaints about corruption, dishonest officials, and unfair treatment. Suddenly, the ancient world begins to feel astonishingly modern, and perhaps that is what unsettles me most about Sumer. The realization that many emotional structures of our own society were already present 5,000 years ago: loans, interest, economic inequality, taxes, bureaucratic records, fear of financial collapse. We often imagine ourselves as radically different from ancient people. Yet, the deeper we look, the more familiar they become. So, a father worrying about debt in Uruk may not have felt so different from someone staring anxiously at unpaid bills today. Civilization changes technology, architecture, and language, but human stress remains strangely consistent. Sometimes late at night, I imagine the streets of Uruk after the markets have closed, laborers returning home exhausted, merchants counting silver by oil lamp, scribes recording obligations into clay tablets while somewhere nearby, a farmer lies awake, unable to sleep, calculating how many more harvests it might take to repay what he owes. And I cannot help asking the same question again and again. Are we truly so different from the Sumerians? Or have human beings simply been building more complicated versions of the same civilization since? Perhaps that is one of the oldest truths hidden inside the story of Mesopotamia. Civilization creates prosperity, but it also creates systems powerful enough to trap people inside invisible chains. And once those systems begin expanding, they rarely disappear completely. They simply evolve generation after generation beneath new cities, new empires, and new names for the same ancient fears. For a long time, I used to imagine civilization as humanity's escape from violence, a movement away from chaos toward order, laws, cooperation, and peace. But the deeper I travel into the story of Sumer, the more complicated that belief becomes. Because civilization did not end human conflict, it transformed it, organized it, expanded it, and made it more efficient than ever before. Before cities, violence between human groups was usually small, scattered, temporary. But once people built permanent settlements, once land became wealth, once canals, harvests, and trade routes determined survival, conflict itself changed. War became systematic, planned, recorded, and increasingly deadly. And somewhere in the dusty plains of ancient Mesopotamia, humanity may have fought its first true organized war. The cities of Lagash and Umma stood not terribly far from one another in southern Sumer, separated by fields, canals, and a disputed stretch of fertile land known as the Guedina, the edge of paradise. Even the name feels strangely tragic now, because paradise itself became something people were willing to kill for. I sometimes imagine the origins of the conflict beginning quietly: arguments over irrigation canals, accusations of stolen water, damaged boundary markers, small tensions growing season after season beneath the heat of Mesopotamia, because in Sumer, water meant life. Whoever controlled the canals controlled the harvest, and whoever controlled the harvest controlled survival itself. Civilization had made resources more valuable and therefore more dangerous. Eventually, negotiations failed, priests invoked divine authority, rulers demanded territory, and armies gathered beneath city banners for one of the earliest recorded territorial wars in human history. What unsettles me most is how familiar it all feels. Borders, resources, fear, retaliation, claims of divine justice. Humanity was already fighting over these things 5,000 years ago. And then there is the Stele of the Vultures, one of the oldest surviving war monuments on Earth. Even now, looking at its carved stone imagery feels haunting because it captures not mythology, but organized violence made visible. On one side, King Aenadum of Lagash marches forward at the head of tightly packed soldiers. Their spears form a dense wall, shields locked together in formation, disciplined, methodical, almost mechanical. This may be one of the earliest depictions of a proto-phalanx, a formation where individual fighters disappear into collective military structure. I think that detail matters deeply because something important changed here. Violence was no longer personal. It had become personal. It had become institutional. The city itself now marched to war, and beneath the soldiers, crushed bodies lie scattered across the battlefield, while vultures descend from the sky carrying severed heads and limbs away in their beaks. The imagery is brutal, disturbingly direct. Ancient Mesopotamian artists did not romanticize battle the way later civilizations often would. They showed war as slaughter, mutilation, and domination. Uh, Sometimes I wonder what ordinary soldiers felt before these battles. Farmers, laborers, young men pulled away from canals and workshops to stand shoulder to shoulder beneath the blazing sun, holding spears with trembling hands while drums echoed across the plains. Perhaps many had never traveled beyond their own city walls before, and now suddenly found themselves facing strangers equally terrified on the opposite side. Civilization had united people inside cities, but in doing so, it also divided them against outsiders. The same systems that allowed cooperation within society enabled organized destruction beyond it. And perhaps that is the great paradox hidden inside the rise of civilization. Large scale cooperation creates both cities and armies. Canals and military formations emerge from the same human ability to organize collective labor. The discipline required to build irrigation systems can also be used to march soldiers across battlefields. Okay. The more I think about it, the more unsettling this becomes, because civilization amplifies everything, not only intelligence and creativity, but also violence. A lone human being can kill only a few others. A civilization can wage war across entire regions. The, the conflict between Lagash and Umma was ultimately about territory, irrigation, and economic survival, but it was also about prestige, power, and divine legitimacy. Kings claimed the gods themselves supported their campaigns. Victory proved heavenly favor, defeat suggested cosmic failure. Religion and warfare became intertwined in dangerous ways because when rulers believed divine order depended upon conquest, compromise became far more difficult. And yet, despite the bloodshed, the wars continued, generation after generation. Cities rebuilt armies, repaired canals, restored walls, and returned once again to conflict, as though violence itself had become woven into the structure of civilization. Sometimes late at night, I imagine the battlefield, after the fighting finally ended, broken spears scattered through mud, wounded soldiers calling weakly for water, vultures circling slowly beneath the burning sky while distant temple bells echo faintly from the victorious city. Somewhere among the dead lie farmers, fathers, sons, people who only months earlier were harvesting barley beside the Euphrates. And I cannot help wondering whether they understood what humanity had become, because once civilization learned how to organize war, there would never truly be a return to smaller violence again. The machinery had been invented: armies, taxation, logistics, military leadership, propaganda, territorial ambition. All the foundations of organized warfare were now in place. And perhaps that is one of the darkest truths hidden inside the story of Sumer. Civilization does not end violence, it industrializes it. Of all the voices that survived from ancient Sumer, none feels more human to me than the voice of Gilgamesh. Because beneath the battles, the monsters, and the legendary journeys, there is something unexpectedly intimate hidden inside the oldest great story humanity ever wrote. Fear. Not fear of war, nor defeat, nor even the gods, but fear of death. Fear of disappearing. Fear of being forgotten by time itself. And perhaps that is why the Epic of Gilgamesh still feels strangely alive after more than 4,000 years, because despite all our technology and modernity, human beings are still haunted by exactly the same question: what happens to us when we are gone? Gilgamesh was remembered as the mighty king of Uruk, builder of walls, conqueror, ruler 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. In the earliest parts of the epic, he appears almost overwhelming in his power, restless, incapable of accepting limits. The people of Uruk complain that their king drives men too hard, takes too much, dominates too completely. So the gods decide to create someone capable of challenging him, Enkidu. And I think Enkidu may be one of the most beautiful figures in all ancient literature, because he begins not as a civilized man, but as something closer to nature itself, wild, covered in hair, running beside animals across open grasslands, untouched by cities, untouched by hierarchy, untouched by civilization. In many ways, he represents the world humanity lost when cities were born. The world before walls, taxes, kings, and organized labor. Yet eventually, Enkidu is brought into human society through food, companionship, and intimacy. He learns language, drinks beer, wears clothing, and enters the world of civilization. And when he finally meets Gilgamesh, the two men fight violently before becoming inseparable friends. Sometimes I think this friendship lies at the emotional heart of the entire story. Because beneath all the mythological grandeur, the Epic of Gilgamesh is really about love, grief, and mortality. Together, they journey into dangerous forests, defeat monsters, and challenge the authority of the gods themselves. They seek glory because glory feels like a form of immortality. If their names are remembered forever, perhaps death itself can somehow be defeated. But then, everything changes. The gods punish them, and Enkidu falls terribly ill. The descriptions of his suffering still feel painfully raw, even today. Fever, weakness, despair, and finally death. And what moves me most is Gilgamesh's reaction, because suddenly the mighty king of Uruk becomes terrifyingly human. He weeps beside the body of his friend, refuses burial for days, unable to accept what has happened. I sometimes imagine him staring into Enkidu's lifeless face through long, silent nights, realizing for the first time that no wall, no kingdom, no power can protect anyone from death. And from that moment onward, Gilgamesh is consumed by fear, not merely grief for Enkidu, but terror for himself. Must I die too? He asks. And in that question, one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature suddenly feels shockingly modern, because every civilization, no matter how advanced, eventually confronts the same unbearable truth. Human life ends. So Gilgamesh abandons his throne and begins a desperate journey searching for immortality. He crosses mountains, passes through darkness, and travels beyond the edges of the known world, seeking Utnapishtim, the ancient flood survivor granted eternal life by the gods. And here the story becomes even more haunting, because buried inside the epic is one of humanity's oldest flood myths. Long before Noah, long before many later traditions, a man survives a divine flood by building a vessel to preserve life, carrying memory through catastrophe. I often wonder whether these flood stories survived because ancient people genuinely remembered environmental disasters from the distant past, rising waters swallowing entire worlds, forcing survivors to rebuild civilization from ruins. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, he learns the devastating truth. Immortality is not meant for ordinary humans. The gods granted it only once, as an exception, not a gift humanity can claim. Yet before Gilgamesh departs, he is told of a mysterious plant hidden beneath the waters capable of restoring youth. Desperate, he retrieves it successfully, and for one brief moment, it seems possible he might escape mortality after all. But then comes one of the saddest scenes in all ancient literature. While Gilgamesh rests, exhausted from his journey, a serpent steals the plant and disappears into the wilderness, shedding its skin as it goes, renewing itself while humanity remains trapped inside aging and death. I think the emotional power of that scene is extraordinary because it captures something deeply human, the feeling that immortality always slips away just beyond our reach. In the end, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, unable to conquer death, unable to escape mortality. Yet something inside him has changed. Standing before the great walls of the city, he finally understands what truly endures, not eternal life, but human creation, memory, and legacy. The walls, the temples, the stories, the civilization itself. Perhaps that is the real answer hidden inside the epic. Human beings cannot live forever, but civilizations try to. Every monument, every written text, every city built against the desert, every story passed from one generation to another is part of humanity's ancient rebellion against oblivion. And maybe that is why the people of Sumer built so desperately, wrote so carefully, and preserved memory so obsessively, because deep beneath all civilization lies the same fear Gilgamesh carried into the wilderness, the fear that someday no one will remember we were ever here at all. Sometimes civilizations do not disappear suddenly. They are absorbed, transformed, reshaped by forces stronger and more ambitious than themselves. And that is what happened to Sumer, because after centuries of rival cities, endless wars, growing inequality, and fragile alliances, a new power slowly emerged from the north, the Akkadians. Unlike The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language related to tongues that would later spread across much of the ancient Near East. For generations, they had lived beside the Sumerians, trading with them, learning from them, sometimes fighting them. The two peoples shared the same rivers, the same dust-filled horizons, and eventually, the same destiny. And somewhere within this shifting world of city-states and fragile kingdoms, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity to change history forever. The more I read about Sargon, the more myth and reality seem to blur together. Ancient legends claimed he was born in secret, placed into a basket by his mother, and set adrift upon a river, rescued and raised by a gardener before eventually rising to power. It is difficult not to notice how strangely familiar that story feels. Echoes of later legends, later prophets, later kings, as though humanity keeps retelling the same dream, the abandoned child destined to rule the world. Whether the details are true or not, one thing is certain. Sargon became something entirely new in human history, not merely a king of one city, but the ruler of what many historians consider the first true empire. Before Sargon, power in Mesopotamia was fragmented. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and fought endlessly for territory, water, and influence. Alliances shifted constantly, victories rarely lasted. But Sargon imagined something larger, not simply conquering neighboring cities, but uniting them beneath centralized authority. I sometimes wonder whether the Sumerians themselves fully understood what was happening as Akkadian armies advanced southward, because conquest alone was not unusual in Mesopotamia, but empire was different. Empire meant distance, bureaucracy, permanent military power, and political control extending across multiple peoples and cultures. It meant the world itself was becoming larger than a single city could comprehend. Sargon's armies swept through Sumerian lands with astonishing success, conquering city after city until much of Mesopotamia answered to Akkad, his capital. Though the city itself has never been conclusively discovered by archaeologists, Akkad became legendary, a symbol of centralized power unlike anything humanity had seen before. I imagine the psychological impact this must have had. For generations, people identified themselves primarily through their city. Uruk, Lagash, each with its own gods, traditions, and identity. But now, they belong to something much larger, an empire stretching across enormous distances beneath a single ruler. And yet, what fascinates me most about Sargon is not simply that he conquered Sumer, but that he adopted so much from it. Because true empires rarely survive through destruction alone. They survive through assimilation, adaptation, and absorption. Sargon did not erase Sumerian civilization. He used it. Sumerian scribes continued writing on clay tablets, temples still operated, myths remained alive, and administrative systems built by the Sumerians became the foundation of Akkadian imperial power. Even the Akkadian kings embraced many Sumerian gods and rituals. The conquerors adapted themselves to the civilization they conquered. And perhaps that is one of the deepest truths about human history. Civilizations survive not because they remain unchanged, but because they evolve. The Sumerians themselves slowly began blending culturally with the Akkadians. Languages mixed, traditions overlapped, identities became more fluid. Over time, Akkadian became increasingly dominant in daily life, yet Sumerian remained sacred and preserved in literature, religion, and scholarship for centuries afterward, almost like Latin in medieval Europe, a language surviving beyond the people who first spoke it. I find something strangely beautiful about that, because even as Sumer declined politically, its ideas continued living inside new civilizations. The walls of empire were built upon Sumerian foundations, writing, bureaucracy, mathematics, religion, law, all carried forward into the Akkadian world. Civilization survived by transforming itself, yet empires also create new pressures to rule vast territories. Sargon depended upon standing armies, taxation, governors, and constant communication across enormous distances. The machinery of civilization grew heavier, more centralized, and more fragile. The greater the empire became, the more energy it required simply to maintain itself. Sometimes I imagine messengers traveling dusty roads between distant cities carrying clay tablets stamped with royal seals, governors anxiously reporting unrest, soldiers marching endlessly beneath the Mesopotamian sun, while somewhere in the background, ordinary people continue grinding grain, repairing canals, and trying to survive beneath systems far larger than themselves. The first empire had arrived, and with it, humanity crossed another threshold, because empire changes how people understand the world. Um, Once cities become part of vast political systems, identity itself shifts. Local traditions mix with foreign cultures, languages blend, and power grows increasingly distant from ordinary lives. And perhaps that is why the story of Sargon feels so modern, because even now, civilizations continue expanding through the same process: conquest, assimilation, adaptation. The names change, but the patterns remain remarkably familiar. Sometimes late at night, I think about the strange irony hidden inside the rise of Akkad. Sumer created civilization, but could not remain unchanged by it. The very systems the Sumerians invented, writing, armies, bureaucracy, urban wealth, eventually made empire possible, and empire transformed the world forever. Yet despite conquest, despite political collapse, despite foreign rulers, Sumer itself never truly vanished. Because civilization survives not by remaining pure, but by leaving pieces of itself inside everything that comes afterward. At first, the rivers of Mesopotamia had seemed almost miraculous. The Tigris and Euphrates transformed dry plains into fertile fields capable of feeding cities larger than humanity had ever known. From those waters came barley, beer, temples, writing, trade, and empire itself. Civilization rose because the land gave abundance. But the more I think about the fall of Sumer, the more tragic the story becomes. Because in the end, the same civilization that mastered nature slowly began destroying the environment that had created it. And perhaps that is one of the oldest warnings in human history. Sometimes collapse does not arrive through sudden invasion or catastrophe. Sometimes it begins silently, grain by grain, season by season, hidden beneath the surface of the soil itself. For centuries, the Sumerians expanded irrigation systems across southern Mesopotamia, canals branching endlessly through the plains like veins carrying life into the fields. At first, the results seemed extraordinary. Harvests increased, populations grew, cities flourished. Yet irrigation in this environment carried a dangerous hidden cost, because under the brutal Mesopotamian sun, water evaporated quickly, leaving behind tiny traces of salt within the soil. Year after year, century after century, the salt slowly accumulated, invisible at first, but relentless. I imagine farmers noticing subtle changes long before anyone fully understood the cause. Barley stalks growing thinner, harvests weakening, patches of land producing less than they once had. Perhaps they blamed the gods, or poor weather, than that, never realizing the earth itself was quietly dying beneath their feet. This process, salinization, would become one of the great environmental disasters of the ancient world. The very irrigation systems that once made civilization possible gradually poisoned the soil, sustaining it. The more canals expanded, the worse the problem became. And there is something deeply haunting about that reality, because the Sumerians were not intentionally destroying their environment. They were trying to survive, trying to feed growing populations, trying to maintain civilization itself. Yet civilization had become trapped inside its own momentum. More cities required more grain required more irrigation increased salinization, and salinization reduced future harvests. Vis-a-vis, a cycle slowly tightening around the entire system. I sometimes think about how frightening this must have felt for ordinary people. Imagine watching the land your family depended upon grow weaker year after year, while taxes remained high, debts accumulated, and rulers still demanded grain for armies and temples. Hunger spread slowly at first, quietly. Then suddenly it is everywhere. Records from Mesopotamia reveal declining agricultural productivity over time. In some areas, wheat became impossible to grow entirely because salt levels had risen too high, forcing farmers to rely increasingly on hardier barley. But even barley eventually struggled. As harvests declined, famine began creeping across parts of the region, and famine changes societies in terrifying ways. Hungry people become desperate. Migration increases, crime rises, social trust weakens. The same civilization that once seemed stable and eternal begins cracking beneath invisible pressure. Yet environmental collapse alone was not the only problem. The Akkadian Empire and later Sumerian states had become increasingly centralized. Vast bureaucracies controlled resources across enormous territories. Taxes flowed upward toward elites, while ordinary laborers carried heavier burdens beneath worsening conditions. The machinery of empire demanded constant energy, armies to maintain, canals to repair, temples to fund, officials to support. But the larger the system became, the more fragile it also became. I often think about this paradox. Civilization creates complexity because complexity increases power. Yet complexity also creates dependence. Once millions of people rely upon tightly interconnected systems, disruption anywhere can spread rapidly everywhere. A failed harvest in one region affects trade, taxation, military supply, and political stability across the entire empire. And eventually, unrest began spreading through Mesopotamia. Local rebellions, weakened authority, displaced populations, social instability. The great urban systems built over centuries no longer felt invincible. Something fundamental was breaking. Some scholars believe periods of severe drought may have worsened conditions even further, transforming already stressed societies into vulnerable ones. Dust storms swept across drying landscapes, rivers shifted unpredictably, and agricultural pressure intensified beneath environmental strain. I sometimes imagine standing outside one of the great Sumerian cities during those difficult years, canals clogged with neglect, fields pale beneath the sun, hungry workers waiting anxiously for grain rations that no longer arrive on time. The city walls still stand, the temples still rise above the streets, but something invisible has changed. Confidence itself is disappearing. And perhaps that is one of the most chilling aspects of civilizational collapse. People often continue believing the system will recover right until the moment it cannot, because for generations, Sumer must have felt eternal. The cities were ancient already, the temples immense, the bureaucracy sophisticated. Writing preserved memory across centuries. Surely such a civilization could not truly fail. Yet history keeps repeating the same lesson. No civilization is immune to the limits of the environment sustaining it. The more powerful societies become, the more resources they consume, and sometimes, without fully realizing it, they slowly undermine the very foundations keeping them alive. Sometimes late at night, I think about the silence that must have spread gradually across once fertile regions of Mesopotamia. Abandoned fields whitening with salt beneath empty skies, canals drying slowly into cracked earth, villages disappearing one by one while distant cities struggle desperately to preserve the illusion of stability. And I cannot help feeling that the story of Sumer carries something deeply modern within it. Because even now, humanity continues wrestling with the same dangerous relationship between civilization and the natural world. We build systems of astonishing complexity. We reshape rivers, exhaust resources, expand endlessly, often believing ourselves powerful enough to overcome environmental limits. Yet, yet the Sumerians already learned a truth that still haunts us today. Civilization can destroy the environment that created it. There is something deeply haunting about the fall of a civilization, especially when that civilization once believed itself chosen by the gods. Because for centuries, the cities of Sumer had stood beneath the blazing skies of Mesopotamia, like monuments to human permanence. Their temples touched the heavens, their scribes preserved memory in clay, their kings ruled behind massive walls while priests spoke in the language of eternity. And yet, in the end, even Sumer could not escape the oldest law of history. Everything built by human hands eventually begins to crumble. The city of was among the last great centers of Sumerian power. Wealthy, sacred, ancient beyond imagination, rising beside the Euphrates beneath towering ziggurats and glittering temple complexes, must once have seemed eternal. Merchants traveled there from distant lands, priests climbed temple stairways carrying offerings to the gods, scribes filled archives with records of taxes, trade, and royal decrees. While ordinary families lived beneath the protection of walls that had stood for generations. I sometimes imagine what it felt like to grow up inside such a city, surrounded by monuments older than your grandparents' grandparents, hearing stories of mighty kings and divine favor, believing the order of the world itself depended upon the survival of Ur. But by the end of the third millennium BCE, the world surrounding Sumer was changing rapidly. Environmental decline had weakened agriculture, political fragmentation spread instability, and pressure from outside groups intensified year after year. Among those moving into Mesopotamia were the Amorites, nomadic Semitic peoples from the western deserts, sometimes portrayed in Sumerian texts almost with suspicion or fear. The Amorites represented forces beyond the control of the old city-states. Migration, movement, cultural transformation. They entered a civilization already struggling to sustain itself. And then from the east came another threat, the Elamites, fierce rivals from the lands beyond Mesopotamia. Together, invasion, internal weakness, and ecological collapse slowly tightened around the final Sumerian kingdoms like a closing noose. I often think about how collapse rarely feels immediate to those living through it. Even as systems weaken, people continue performing ordinary routines. Markets still open, priests still conduct rituals, taxes are still collected, children still play in dusty streets. Civilization often appears stable right until the moment stability suddenly disappears. And then came the siege. The armies surrounding cut off supply lines. Fields beyond the walls became inaccessible. Trade routes collapsed. Hunger spread silently through the city. I imagine families rationing barley more carefully each week. Mothers pretending not to be hungry so children could eat. Exhausted guards watching the horizon from crumbling walls while fear slowly replaces confidence. Starvation changes people. It erodes dignity, trust, hope. The great machinery of civilization begins breaking apart from within. The temples that once distributed abundance can no longer feed the population. Authority weakens, desperation spreads, and somewhere inside the darkened streets of people must have begun asking terrifying questions. Had the gods abandoned them? Because in Mesopotamian thought, political collapse was never merely political. It was cosmic. If cities fell, if famine spread, if enemies conquered sacred lands, it meant divine order itself had fractured. The gods who once protected civilization were withdrawing their favor. That emotional devastation survives most powerfully in one of the oldest mourning texts ever written, the Lament for Ur. Even now, reading fragments of it feels painfully intimate. The storm that annihilates the land roared against the city. The people lay broken in heaps. Silence filled the holy places. I sometimes pause when I read those ancient lines because they no longer sound like distant archaeology. They sound like grief, real human grief, written by people watching their world disappear around them. The lament describes abandoned temples, empty streets, corpses unburied, smoke rising from destruction while survivors wander through ruins searching desperately for meaning. It is apocalyptic in the truest sense, not merely because buildings collapse, but because an entire worldview collapses with them. The people of Sumer had believed their civilization represented divine order on earth, and now the sacred cities themselves were falling into silence. Eventually, the Elamites breached Ur, the city was looted, temples desecrated, treasures carried away, and the last Sumerian king captured and taken into exile. One of humanity's first great civilizations had effectively reached its end. Yet what moves me most about this moment is not simply the destruction, but the emotional shock hidden beneath it. Because for generations, the Sumerians had likely assumed their civilization would endure forever. Their cities were ancient already, their writing preserved memory, their temples connected heaven and earth. How could something so old and powerful simply vanish? But history keeps teaching the same cruel lesson. Permanence is often an illusion. Sometimes late at night, I imagine the final nights of Ur, fires burning in the distance, frightened families gathering possessions in silence, temple bells echoing faintly across smoke-filled streets while somewhere beyond the walls, enemy soldiers move through the darkness. And above all of it, the stars still shine coldly over Mesopotamia as they always had, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilizations beneath them. Yet, even in destruction, Sumer did not entirely disappear. Its language, myths, mathematics, writing, and memory survived inside the civilizations that followed. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, all inherited pieces of the world Sumer had created. And perhaps that is the strange tragedy of civilization. Empires fall, cities burn, gods are forgotten, yet fragments continue living on inside the future. Sometimes I think the lament for Ur is not only mourning a city, but mourning the human realization that no civilization, no matter how brilliant, can escape time forever. Sometimes I think the strangest thing about civilizations is that they rarely disappear completely. Even after cities burn, languages fade, temples collapse, and kings are forgotten, something always survives, fragments moving quietly through history like embers carried by the wind. And perhaps no civilization proves this more powerfully than Sumer. Because although the Sumerians themselves eventually vanished as a distinct people, the world they created never truly died. After the fall of Ur, survivors scattered across Mesopotamia. Priests, scribes, merchants, laborers, refugees carrying memories of a broken civilization into new cities and kingdoms. The old Sumerian world dissolved slowly into the cultures surrounding it. Yet its ideas remained astonishingly resilient. Sumerian writing continued to be studied for centuries. Temple rituals survived, myths endured, mathematics persisted, and administrative systems built beside the Euphrates continued shaping empires long after Sumerian political power had collapsed. I sometimes imagine old scribes teaching children a language already ancient in their own time, pressing wedge-shaped signs into clay, while knowing the world that first created those symbols had already vanished. There is something deeply moving about that image, humanity preserving memory even after the civilization itself has fallen. And slowly, from the ruins of Sumer, new powers rose, Among them, Babylon. At first, Babylon was only a modest city beside the Euphrates, one settlement among many in Mesopotamia. Yet, over time, it absorbed the cultural inheritance of Sumer and transformed it into something new. The Babylonians adopted Sumerian gods, copied Sumerian myths, preserved Sumerian literature, and built their civilization upon foundations the Sumerians had created thousands of years earlier. In many ways, Babylon became the spiritual heir of Sumer. And eventually, one ruler would shape this inheritance into one of the most influential legal systems in ancient history: Hammurabi. I often think about Hammurabi standing before his famous law code carved into black stone, declaring order, justice, punishment, and social hierarchy for an enormous kingdom. Yet beneath those laws lay echoes of far older traditions, systems of administration, taxation, contracts, and legal thinking inherited from Sumerian civilization. Even the idea that society could be governed through written law traced its roots back to the clay tablets of Mesopotamia. The more I study ancient history, the more I realize how little truly disappears. Civilizations are like rivers, merging into one another, carrying pieces of the past endlessly forward into the future. And then, after centuries passed, even Babylon faded. Empires rose and collapsed, new religions spread, languages changed, and eventually the cities of Sumer vanished beneath desert sands. The ziggurats crumbled, canals dried, and the names of Uruk, and Lagash slowly faded from human memory. For thousands of years, the first civilization on Earth became almost entirely forgotten. I find that silence haunting. Imagine creating writing, cities, mathematics, law, and organized society itself, only for future generations to forget you ever existed, like Brexit. By the 19th century, the strange wedge-shaped symbols carved into clay tablets were meaningless to most people. The ruins scattered across Iraq looked like little more than dusty hills beneath the sun. Yet beneath those hills, entire worlds still slept, waiting to be remembered again. And then archaeologists arrived, men driven by obsession, curiosity, and the ancient human desire to uncover lost civilizations. Among them was Leonard Woolley, whose excavations at revealed astonishing treasures buried beneath the earth. Royal tombs filled with gold, musical instruments, jewelry, weapons, and the haunting remains of attendants sacrificed beside their rulers thousands of years earlier. I sometimes imagine Woolley standing silently inside those excavated chambers for the first time, lantern light flickering across artifacts untouched since the Bronze Age, realizing he was looking directly into the forgotten dawn of civilization itself. Slowly, tablet by tablet, ruin by ruin, humanity began rediscovering Sumer. Scholars deciphered cuneiform, myths returned to life, and voices silent for millennia began speaking once again. Suddenly, the ancient Sumerians were no longer shadows. We could hear their prayers, their jokes, their contracts, their fears, their love poems, their laments for fallen cities. The dead were speaking again through clay. And what they revealed changed how humanity understood itself. Because before the rediscovery of Sumer, many people believed civilization began much later. Yet beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered something astonishing: the first cities, the first schools, the first writing, the first bureaucracy, the first large-scale economies, the first recorded wars. Humanity's earliest experiments with civilization had been there all along, buried quietly beneath the desert, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes late at night, I think about how much of our modern world still carries the fingerprints of Sumer. We divide hours into 60 minutes because of Mesopotamian mathematics. We rely on written contracts, bureaucratic records, urban life, organized government, taxation, legal systems, and literature shaped by patterns first emerging beside the Tigris and Euphrates. Even the idea of civilization itself was born there. The Sumerians are gone, yet in strange ways we are still living inside structures they created. And perhaps that is the final paradox of Sumer. The civilization disappeared, but its memory became permanent. Not because its cities survived, but because its ideas did. Maybe that is what Gilgamesh ultimately discovered long ago beneath the walls of Uruk. Human beings cannot escape death. Civilizations cannot escape collapse, but memory, stories, and creation can travel far beyond the people who first imagined them. Sometimes I picture the ancient scribes of Sumer pressing symbols into wet clay beneath oil lamps while outside, the rivers moved silently through the darkness. They could never have imagined that thousands of years later, people from another world would still whisper their names, still search their ruins, ruins, still listen to their stories before sleep. Sumer disappeared, but the world we live in is still built upon its memory.